Just one more minute to let people continue to join. Okay, it looks like we have quite a few people joining now. This is Scott Wintershaw with the IEP. I'm going to be the facilitator for the workshop today. I'm just going to keep these opening comments pretty brief. The first thing I would point everyone to is in the chat for the team's call, the team session, Lisa on from PG&E already sent a lot of helpful information and reminders about upcoming deadlines and other workshops. The next workshop is the recently added workshop on storage issues that's happening this Friday. So if you didn't have that in your calendars already, be sure to add that. Look in your inboxes for information if you missed it, or you can ask us in the chat. So today we've got a fairly packed agenda. Everything by 3. To start with, we're going to be presenting some of the results from the elements survey that was distributed last week, and that party was supposed to respond to. We have some pretty interesting results. It looks like for some of the elements, there are some pretty clear winners and losers with strong preferences in a large proportion of the parties. And for others, it's more of a mixed bag that leaves us still needing to figure out how to hopefully achieve more consensus on some of those items. So I'm going to turn it over to Sergio is going to share his screen and go over the presentation of the survey results. Let's see, I hear, it looks like somebody's saying, hang on one second. I'm going to switch over to a different device. Just give me 1 minute.
Can everyone, please, everybody who's not talking, please mute. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Is that any better?
Yeah, that sounds better, Scott.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. So I was just saying that we have the results from the element survey, and there's some pretty interesting results where some of the elements, it looks like parties are pretty clearly converging around a pretty strong consensus. But with others, there's more of a mixed bag that leaves all of us needing to figure out if we can bring our positions more into alignment. So I'm going to hand it over to Sergio, who's going to give a quick introduction, and then Julia and Bridget will go over most of the substance of the results.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Scott. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
I see it.
Perfect. So thanks for that, and welcome everyone to the workshop. I'm happy to introduce these results of our elements survey. Just to clarify a little bit about this effort, this is a joint effort from all the co-facilitators of the different RA workshops. I think CISA was involved, of course, but also CAISO, CalCCA, IEP, and others as well. Today, you'll be hearing more specifically from Bridget from Kaizo and Julia from LDSEC. So we had a good amount of respondents. We actually, as many of you may have noted, we left the survey open throughout the end of last week so that we could get a little bit more feedback. We got emails directly, Jen and I, like, hey, we really want to answer, but we can make it on Wednesday, so we kept it open. What we've seen is about 22 total responses. We left open-ended what type of organization you were. So here we're trying to concentrate them or in a different way between, let's say, sellers and top, buyers, NGOs, trade organizations that represent, other parties, regulatory or other, and customers. The flow of this presentation will be we'll be talking about some of the answers, basically highlighting where we see we're getting or approaching consensus, and all of this are presented on like tables that we've summarized the results. So with that, I'll pass it on to Bridget, and please just tell me next slide, and I'll keep doing that. Don't worry.
Hey, so it's Julia. I'll start off, and thank you
Okay.
so much for pulling this together. And good morning, everyone. Julia Prochnik with the Long Duration Energy Storage Association of California. Really appreciate the team's effort of pulling this together and really being sensitive to all the different requests we got. So next slide. Looking at the structural elements first, the initial questions, what was the preference for the overall system RA? So 15 organizations responded about gross load, 2 for net load, and 4 for other. And the next slide. So then we looked at the preference for the number of slices per compliance period. So the number of organizations you see on the left and the responses on the right. So 3 organizations said there should be showings for 2 seasons, 2 organizations said showings for 4 seasons, and then 15 organizations said there should be monthly showings, and then 2 had others. When the other category either kind of said, added kind of their own thoughts or had a combination. Next slide. So then we asked the groups to look at the preference for the load forecast values.
Actually, I just realized these titles are wrong. So the 5 is actually about the number of seasons, no?
I was just going to ask you because I'm like, we just had seasons when I was reading it. So thanks
The
for
number of
catching
compliance periods. And now this is about preference for the number of slices per compliance period. Sorry about that. I think the titles were moved.
And our cut and paste.
Go ahead.
We were all working on this yesterday to get it all ready in time. So thanks. Let's go back just to reiterate again, number 5, just so that everyone sees this. So the number of compliance periods, again, we 3 organizations focus on 2 seasons, 2 organizations focus on 4 seasons, and 15 organizations focus on monthly showings, and then 2 for other. So then moving to slide 6, where there's still a little typo, but numbers. Out of the 22 organizations, the majority looked at the 24 1-hour slices, but then there were 8 for the 2 slices, 1 for the 6, and then 1 other, which was kind of looking at a combination or options. Numbers at slide 7. So then when we asked the group for input on the preference for the load forecast values to derive the slice and hourly requirements for each compliance period. There were 5 organizations that wanted the maximum value used for each slice. There were 8 for worst day, and then 7 for other. So this is, one of the slides that Sergio was highlighting that we might want to come back to and look forward to the presentations today of going into the details a bit more here. I'll hand it over to Bridget for resource counting.
Great, thank you. So go to the next slide. So here we're asking about preferences for assigning resources and QC values. And here there's sort of a split, but we see sort of a growing consensus around multiple or slice-specific NQC values. Next slide. And then here we're asking about preferences for RA resource transactions and whether resources can be bundled or unbundled across slices. And we see a slight majority for bundling of products. So the LLCs purchase all resources RA attributes for all slices. Next slide. Here we're asking about resource counting for dispatchable thermal resources. And while it's a kind of an even split across, there seems to be more of a consensus towards moving towards a UCAP. So whether a full UCAP based on the CAISO's proposal of the top 20% of hours, or a UCAP light, which only looks at outages due to ambient D rates. And then the other category, a lot of the respondents were, it depends on the overarching framework. And so they didn't quite offer any responses on resource counting, but thought it should be tied to the overarching framework. Next slide. I can't tell if my computer froze or if the presentation.
This is the next slide for energy limited dispatchable resources.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was getting feedback. So for this, so this is for a daily energy limitation. So where the resource has something like a nighttime limitation. Again, we're starting to see more support towards moving to a UCAP, and there was stronger support for the 20% of tightest supply cushion hours approach to UCAP. Next slide. So here we're asking about resource counting for solar resources. And again, there's kind of a split across the options with sort of half the respondents supporting some version of ELCC and the other 9 supporting exceedance for each slice. So here, again, I think it might depend on the overarching framework, which direction we go. Next slide. This question asked about what level of exceedance should be used if we move towards an exceedance. And again, there's not real consensus here either, with slight support for 50%, but then larger for other. And so I think here the respondents were asking for additional analysis before selecting a specific exceedance level. Here we're asking about resource counting for wind. Again, you see a similar split between some version of ELCC and exceedance. However, there was slightly more support for ELCC for wind resources than there was for solar. Next slide. But again, we see sort of a similar split on not real consensus on the level of exceedance, with 50% having 5 organizations, but a larger majority saying other or not applicable. So again, I think if we move to exceedance, there needs to be more analysis on helping parties determine what level we should select. Next slide. So for hydro counting, there's sort of a clear consensus to maintain the current 10-year exceedance-based methodology that more heavily weights the dry hydro years. Next slide. So for storage, I would say there's also a similar kind of split or not real consensus, although there's a slight majority for selecting PMAX over the number of hours shown, subject to interconnection limits. So I feel like storage is another area where parties need to discuss more before selecting a counting methodology. And so I know we have a workshop on Friday to talk more about storage. So hopefully we can talk more about resource counting for storage. Next slide. Hybrid resources is another area where there's not real consensus with treatment of the components as separate and applying the applicable QC methodologies for each component, having 6, but then 7 other respondents. So also seems like hybrid resources are another area for further discussion. Next slide. Whereas for co-located resources, there seems to be growing consensus around treating the components as separate and applying the applicable QC methodology for each component. So that had 13 responses. Next slide. For non-dispatchable resources, there was a growing consensus around using the historic megawatt output or exceedance during each slice. Next slide. Although there were also a lot of respondents that didn't offer response here, so because the counts are kind of low. Next slide. And then for demand response, there's similarly a lack of consensus with some support for a LIP-informed ELCC, but a lot of the other responses indicated support for deferring or coordinating with the CEC process that's being run. And so DR is another area that needs further discussion. Okay, I'll hand it back to Julia.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, Sergio. Okay, so moving on to need determination and allocation. Next slide. So then we asked, what was the preference for how to allocate needs among the load serving entities? And this was kind of, again, there was a slight majority, but the organizations, one wanted the top-down approach based on the coincident peak and pro rata allocation. Then 3 organizations wanted the current top-down approach where the CEC uses the IPER. And then 4 organizations wanted the bottom-up approach based on the load serving entity's load shape plus the adjustment to the coincident peak. And then both 2 organizations wanted by customer class based on the ISO's coincident peak, but also allocated on the LSC's customer classes. And then 2 also had other responses, which were either kind of a combination or a kind of a slight alteration, new idea. Slide, please. So then we asked supporting a regular process to conduct an LOLE study to support the RA program requirements, and how many organizations. This is a great slide, at least show one majority. 17 wanted yes, 2 wanted no, and 1 had other. So large majority here. Next slide, please. And then the position on trading RA load obligation, again, a pretty significant majority of 10 organizations saying that no trading of RA load. 1 did want trading of RA load, and then 5 were other responses and other ideas, other combinations. Next slide, please.
That is the final slide.
That is the last one. Okay, great. Thank you. So again, just appreciate everyone contributed their responses, giving us kind of food for thought, knowing that this isn't set in stone, but it just helps us get a better sense of some of the areas where there's a large majority of consensus and other areas where we still have some more discussion. So again, thank you all very much. And thanks, Bridget, for really putting together the questions and the PowerPoint and helping us all have the input from the working team and the working group. And thanks, Sergio, for sending it out to the larger distribution group.
Sure. I see 2 questions. Let's see. Should we take them, Scott? Your call. Asking the facilitators here.
And then, Sergio, I would recommend you go ahead and put the slide deck back up. I'm sure we're going to want to refer to it. So,
sending it out to everybody.
So why don't we start with Doug Carpa, had his hand up first, and Carrie after that.
Yeah, hi, Doug Carpa for Peninsula Clean Energy. I just wanted to give a little color for those who've not been part of the conversation. I think the CCAs largely did not respond to this. I know we didn't in large measure because our internal staff felt like we weren't really ready to make a decision about a lot of these elements. Particularly before hearing more about the Gridwell approach. So we're sort of a little bit on the fence about like making a determination about what we favor before we feel like we have all the facts. And so I think, that's like 20 some organizations, or 1 if you count LCCA. Yeah, exactly. Among the respondents, that US utility ESP4 number, I think like come next week that will go up. And if it's helpful, I'm happy to talk to my folks and fill it out and send it to you later and see if that changes anything. Because we really don't know. I think in a lot of these questions how we would actually come down. We're still looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, this is Sergio from CISA. The survey is not closed, really. Like, if someone still has the link, you could keep submitting responses. So if that is okay with the co-facilitation team, I don't see a problem there.
Okay, all right, Carrie, you're up.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley from Gridwell Consulting. I was just wondering if you can go back to the slide that had the NQC preference. It was right after the compliance, perhaps. Yeah, this one. Thanks. I think it was characterized as there was preference for multiple, but I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, because it seems like 11 organizations either want 1 or 2 NQC values. And I just think that is an important thing to note, because it's pretty evenly split. And I was hoping maybe the people who went through these and got to read through all the others could give a general characterization on whether the same entities that wanted, 1 or 2 NQCs were the ones that wanted, ELCC, or whether there was any trends you saw overall.
Carrie, yeah, I'll have to go back and look, but I want to say I recall this question pretty clearly correlating with folks that were supporting like ELCC or 2 slices. So I think it seemed to me that the responses seemed to tie together where if you were more supportive of elements of the Gridwell proposal, you tended to answer across the board in that direction. And then if you were more supportive of SCE's kind of slice of day proposal, you tended to answer in line with that framework. I think areas where there kind of wasn't as clear of a split, so like I'd say like level of exceedance level didn't really follow any patterns across the 2 proposals. But I don't, like going through it, I didn't really get a sense that there was sort of responses all over the place, but it seems to me, again, that respondents tended to answer in line with sort of their favorite framework, and were fairly consistent in their selection. I think like the storage and the hybrids and the co-located and other resources that we haven't really talked about as much, I think the responses were a little bit more wishy-washy. Again, I think because SCE and Gridwell's proposal might be a little light in details in those areas. So, or there's areas we just haven't discussed as much. But the areas that I think we have the most details around, responses, again, tended to kind of fall in line with the 2 kind of proposals.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Bridget. That's helpful context.
Yeah, thank you, Bridget. Well said.
If I could add a little bit to that, this is Sergio from CISA. You can see the correlation a little bit from this the slide 5 to 9, right? So 15 people want something that aligns with SCE's proposal, but of those 15, only 12 want 24-hourly slices, right? And then that correlation drops even more when we go to more specific topics of the NQC values or even how we count. I think the plan of the co-facilitator team was not to give indication of preferences for like specific proposals in this one. That's why it's the element survey. And we do think that perhaps having a proposal survey after this workshop could be useful. But here we wanted to give parties the ability to be like open without the restriction of what the different proposals are on which are their preferences. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Just to go back to what you said though about the monthly, we got that feedback in the comments themselves. So Gridwell's proposal is monthly, right? And it's helpful because I heard feedback when I changed it to monthly. A couple people complained, and I bet they were the ones who wanted the 2 compliance periods. So it does seem though we are coalescing around at least 2 things, right? Everyone wants to keep the monthly for the most part, and everyone thinks we should do LLE studies. And then I think the only other takeaway is that we're still pretty split. Does that seem
Probably
like an accurate
gross load.
characterization?
Gross load is another thing where there's some
Yeah.
consensus.
Yeah.
Just trying to find silver linings here.
Okay, is that it, Carrie?
Yeah, that's it.
I actually raised my own hand here, and some of what I was going to say was already covered, but I thought it would just be worth taking a couple minutes to look at the core elements. So if you go down to slide 4, for example, then you see pretty strong consensus that once people began to really think about how net load would work, that it began to fall out of favor. It just seemed like an unnecessary complication. If you get on to the next slide, in full disclosure, IEP was a party that supported the idea of at least looking seriously going to 2 compliance periods. Gridwell's original proposal, that it would just simplify the administrative burden for everyone, and that if resources are adequate in the worst summer month and the worst winter month, then they're probably adequate in all other months. But it seems like there's also a lot of preference for just maintaining more alignment with the status quo, since the systems are already set up to do that. And yeah, I think we don't really care that much. It seems like it's more of a benefit for LSEs and CPUC staff than it is for the sellers of RA. And if you go to the next slide, there is more of a split, but I think a really striking finding is that PG&E's proposal, which was nominally the basis of the PUC decision and what we were all ordered to implement, has almost no support at this point. That as we really began to think about how it would work, it just the complexities didn't really seem to be outweighed by any advantages. And so we can go forward probably really focusing on either the 24 1-hour slices and maybe given the support for 2 slices, continue to think about how that might be an option. But that maybe we can just drop the 6x4 slice proposal altogether at this point. Those are just my observations. All right, that was all for me. And next we have Nancy.
Hi there. I wondered if it's possible to modify or add questions, particularly on exceedance. It seems to me that folks that do not prefer exceedance should nevertheless be able to indicate what exceedance values they would prefer if that method is selected. And so I feel like we're not getting the full picture of, the range of exceedance values that, folks would advocate. And the same may be true of some other questions. Maybe we might need to kind of tweak. Is that possible?
Well, Nancy, this is Scott. I can let Bridget maybe add some additional detail. But there was nothing that necessarily prevented a party that preferred ELCC generally from weighing in on the exceedance values. So there probably is some overlap, I assume, between parties that expressed preference for ELCC-based approach, but then also expressed an opinion on the exceedance value.
Well, the survey pretty well indicated you weren't supposed to indicate if that wasn't your method. So can we go back in and change our response then?
Yeah, Sergio, I don't know if there's any way for a party to reopen their already submitted set of responses.
That sounds like a lot of, that sounds pretty complicated. Just submit a new response, I would say.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, even if this option existed, you didn't need to click this option. For example, when we go to wind, maybe you're right, like this created some issues here. But yeah, I think if another response can come in, it'll be recorded and we can update with that. I'll just eliminate your responses from before and keep the new one.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
Sorry, next, if that's all, Nancy, next up we have Peter.
Yeah, is the underlying data going to be made available for analysis? I mean, they certainly have provided summaries of the questions, but there have been some cross correlations that I think have only been spoken to at a high level. and have been done so by people. I mean, I just would like to sort of see is the underlying data going to be made available?
Yeah, I have no problem doing that. I can email it somehow. If you guys think to all parties of the 2RA proceedings is viable, or maybe that's excessive, but it's a pretty small Excel file. Just bear in mind that it's limited to today, right? So for example, if the CCAs answer next week or CalWIA changes their answers, etc., that won't be reflected in the current Excel. We would need to give a little bit more time. But
no, I understand that, and you know, we might want to just once you decide to close the survey, that it might make sense to make available the underlying data, and you know, we could certainly could be posted on the PUC's website where we're putting all the data from the workshops. But I think that would be helpful in allowing parties to basically look at the answers and responses and see sort of draw their own conclusions across, particularly for cross correlations.
Yeah, I would just ask some of the parties that were involved in that co-facilitation discussion about highlighting that this is preliminary, confidential, non-binding. If there's any concerns with sharing that widely, think it through. I'm a bit new to those confidentiality concerns, so if co-facilitators can think of that and see how we move forward, CISA, we can gladly share that Excel. Yeah.
Yeah, Sergio, good point. I'll take that to my members, WPTF members, and get back to you as soon as I can.
We could also take some of the identifying information out and just leave it as like org 1, org 2, or just put the generic org type. So you wouldn't.
That's a great idea.
Like tie an answer to a specific party. So I think it'd be best if we just put it out de-identified, but then you could at least see like the numbers of organizations that might be like coalescing around certain elements or other patterns. So that would be my advice if we're going to put it out widely, is to kind of take some of the identifying information out and then just put the responses.
I agree. Point.
Yeah, that sounds good. And if there are some parties who either haven't submitted responses yet or intend to submit a fresh set of responses, I guess I would also recommend that we kind of date or serialize the versions that go out. Okay, so next up we have Paul.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson on behalf of CLICA. I think the response to Peter may address my question here, but it was sort of, the slide you got presented here is, what were some of the other preferences? There were 7 of them for WIN, and I was kind of curious to know what those are, because it's, there's quite a few of listed as others, and I think there's some other slides too where the other option had quite a few responses, so it'd be interesting to know what those others are, like that one.
I think putting out the survey would tell you the others, but just for now, I can tell you that for the exceedance level, the others tended to be requests for further analysis. And I think this preference for worse was also a request for further analysis. So some of the others were either combos of the responses or requests for further information, or said it depended on what the structural framework was. But we can, I think definitely putting out the de-identified survey results would give parties further idea of what the others were.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, we're coming up on time for SE to begin. I also had my hand raised again to make a quick comment, and I see Mary Lynch has her hand raised. So let's close it off there. I'll just make an observation that the amount of support for incremental ELCC I thought was surprising. because while I favor incremental ELCC as a signal about which new resources to procure going forward, I don't understand how incremental ELCC works for RA, especially on a year ahead basis, when what matters is the capacity value of resources across the entire fleet at that given point in time. So just a question to toss out there to the proponents of incremental ELCC that think about and be able to explain as we move forward. Okay, so I'll hand it over to Mary, and then let's have SCE start their presentation.
Yeah, this is Mary Lynch with Constellation, and I just wanted to ask, with respect to distribution of the surveys, is it correct that has there been an agreement that the survey, isn't something that folks will be pointing to in comments? Is it? I'm just trying to be sure I understand what the survey is going to be used for. Is it something that folks might reference once we get a PD, or what is the purpose of distributing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the description and the cover email that we sent out to parties of the RA proceeding, we described how the survey is preliminary and it's only to indicate to co-facilitators if we're achieving areas of consensus or not. We also mentioned that the plan is just to use this as indicative preferences for the purposes of our workshop so that we can, spend time in matters that seem that we're moving towards there rather than others. But I don't think the intent is to tie parties to the preferences that they answered or, argue that this shows in a way that we should completely omit other ideas. Just give us an indication of where we're moving, since this type of online gatherings may be a little bit less flexible in doing that than before when we had in-person workshops. That's my take.
Okay, I think I've always felt like the survey was a bit unusual in that it's not subject to settlement discussion protections or, it's just really very informal. And I just wanted to be sure we all understood how and when it might, crop up as the discussions are ongoing and we move into PDs and comments on PDs. And seems to me it could get a little tricky or messy, perhaps.
No, actually, Mary, this is great clap for WPTF. We did make it explicit that the survey responses, the individual survey responses at a minimum are covered by Rule 12.6. So nothing in the survey can be used against the party in the formal proceeding. I think that the general consensus was, we're not going to need this we're not going to put this in the workshop report for sure. Parties could, I guess, refer to it generally in their informal comments, but that there's a question there about whether the informal comments are attached to the workshop report. In that case, again, I think, we should err on the side of not including this in the record. It's really just meant to be a tool for us to assess us. I think Sergio did a really good job of describing it, what the purpose of it is. So the intent is not to have this as part of the record and not have this be shaping advocacy. It's really just for us to all have a gut check at this point. Where are we in terms of the discussions?
Yeah, thanks for that, Greg. And in that note, that's why I think me personally, as someone that's joined the industry in the last 3 years, I differ to your expertise on how to treat how we post the Excel. Whatever you guys agree on, we can share the data, but it's a good point to have that in mind. So thank you.
Okay, with that, I think we need to move on to the SE presentation.
Good morning. I don't know if people can hear me. It's Jeff Nelson here from SCE. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Great. And I think I have Brent joining also. Good morning. Oops. I've got to reappear. Boom, boom. And hopefully people can see a slide deck that says recap of 24-hour slices. Can people see that okay?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for the feedback. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having us back. And we just want to spend some time recapping where we are. Brent and I are going to go through some details in the slides. We've tried to pay attention to all the arguments, pros, cons, ideas, suggestions. I think these have been very, very helpful workshops. We've had a bunch of sidebar calls with folks. And we are going to propose some minor changes to our structure. But after hearing everything, we're still feeling that the 24-hour slices is the way to go. It really seems to address just a large dimension of issues and the path forward. It really looks like the path forward to get us well down the road in California's goals. So I'll go to overall findings. Brent and I are going to sort of tag team a little bit, and I'll start out. Brent, please feel free to jump in if there's points I've missed. So after hearing everything, after hearing all the discussion, we still think that the 24-hour slice proposal is the best option on the table. And we do understand a lot of the complex arguments on various dimensions. And we actually think that some of those, once we decide on a framework, we should deep dive those. And a lot of them have to do with sort of resource counting and shaping and what levels of exceedances and things like that. So our general framework is to say, once we know what sort of slices we're using, and I'm getting some feedback. If people wouldn't mind muting if they're not talking, thank you. Once we decide on a framework, we think there's another level to dig deeper into that. So we're going to stay at sort of the framework structure and be very open to, once we have the framework decided, what the proper specific accounting and some of the proper nuances will be within that framework. So we recommend that the PUC move forward with the 24-hour framework, and we've got some other questions we can answer once we made that decision. Key one is like, well, what reliability standard are we going to drive to? Are we going to stay to 1 in 10? Or are we going to go to a 1 in 20 or 1 in 5? I don't know, but we can decide that from a policy standpoint. And within that, then we need to decide what the appropriate monthly profiles are for wind and solar in our framework. And then once we've got a reliability target, once we've decided on appropriate profiles, we can figure out what planning reserve margin is necessary to meet those reliability standards. So I think those are all very, very important discussions. We're not proposing specific answers at this stage, but once we have the framework, we'll have to answer those. We really looked at some of the larger frameworks, the larger slice frameworks, and all we saw was it creating sort of inefficiencies, and we didn't see administrative simplicity pulling out. And it was interesting in the survey that I'll call the 6x4 slice really did not have much support. I think there's only one vote on the survey. We saw that too. And we didn't like the way it was accounting properly for renewables, for wind solar profiles, for the usage of batteries. And we just felt that the other proposals really fell short of meeting some of the key policy objectives the PUC set out to meet in this process. We read reliability and cost, and we really feel that the 24-hour framework is really solid for reliability, and at the same time, it fairly treats resources based on what we think they can do to help keep costs down. And some of the concerns we really had on some of the proposals, I'll call Gridwell's out particularly. It seemed extremely punitive to renewable resources, where even with a peak and gross peak, it would count some sort of derated ELCC type value for the gross peak, and then would count sort of the worst performance over some period during the net peak for the resources, which was effectively, as a result of, let's just say, taking 100 megawatt nameplate of solar and giving it maybe 25 megawatts during the gross peak, and practically speaking 0 during the other showing period. And likewise for wind, practically it looks like it's derating wind to 0 in the gross peak by taking a worse period. And we just don't see how that is all consistent with the PUC's objectives of moving forward with California's renewable goals in a cost-effective manner. It seems extremely punitive and just not at all realistic to the type of fleets that we're generating. Another problem we really had with it is that the PUC wanted to make sure we were serving load in every hour. And it doesn't even look at the hours, it looks at 2 points. So we just don't see how that's consistent with that at all. And more, the energy limitations, as we move to a larger and larger battery fleet, we need to have a proposal that explicitly recognizes the important role of batteries, the flexibility that batteries are bringing to the grid, and importantly, that batteries without energy are paperweights, right? You got to have some energy to be able to fill these batteries up so that you can use the energy when you need it. And we didn't see that at all in the Gridwell proposal. And the 24-hour slice is very, very clear. We'll talk about some modifications we've made to refine it further to be as, let's just say, as accurate, I don't want to say friendly, but as honest as we can with batteries, with wind, and with solar. So anyways, we see it as just the best from pretty much all of the dimensions of reliability, of the changing fleet, of making sure we're treating the new fleet in sort of an engineeringly honest way, and at the same time being equally fair to traditional resources and recognizing the dispatchability, flexibility, the value they bring too. We're not penalizing anybody. We're trying to do everything as intellectually and engineeringly honest as we can in this framework. So that's a quick summary of why we're still there. I'm going to turn the next slide over to Brent to really sort of deep dive on some of these dimensions. Unless, Brent, you had any other follow-up on the first slide.
No, I think you covered that well. So I'll get a little bit deeper in here. And so there's a lot of words. I probably won't say them all, but these are kind of the key dimensions that we've discussed in previous workshops, and we've laid them out as like a single table here. So so slices, 24 single-hour slices for a month. So that's monthly showings, like a single showing that covers 24 slices, meets their load forecast, their slice by slice load forecast plus a PRM, and within the capabilities of the resources and with excess RA capacity to cover the battery needs, battery charging. Solar and wind, so hourly profiles would need to be determined. We expect there to be like a single number that for what those resources count for, and then a profile to be applied based on a number. So any kind of resource specific performance characteristics can be handled via that kind of single number, and then it's just scaled with the shape. Standalone batteries kind of shown up to their maximum capacity within their capabilities. A lot of those capabilities are already articulated in the CAISO RDT, and it would expect that some of those could be used to validate the showings of batteries. Hybrid resources, we have kind of worked up some ideas if similar to a standalone battery. The idea is a hybrid resource should be shown within its capabilities, kind of the expectation of the underlying renewable. Presumably these are renewable battery hybrids, but within the capabilities on the underlying renewable and the battery, with all the the characteristics of that resource being recognized. Use limited resources. So think about like hourly, daily hourly limitations, like a peaker that due to emissions limits can only run 9 hours, or a a resource that, DR potentially can only run in the afternoon hours for 4 hours. Those would be, within their capabilities once again. So, if it's a 4-hour resource, you can only show it for 4 hours on your showing. Other resources like things that kind of just, are more consistent across the day, similar to today, where you can count that NQC in all hours. So like a 24-hour CCGT counts for all hours at that full value, and then geothermal biomass, you can kind of imagine that those are relatively flat as well. And then specific contractor resources, imports, within their import shape. So if it's a heavy load import 6x16, you show the 16 hours. Okay, so I guess I kind of hit that a little bit hard, so I'll go quicker. Load forecast, we think this should be gross. So we're actually netting each hour to show compliance, right? So you start with your gross plus PRM, and then you net out all your resources in each hourly slice. Exactly, which weather is used for this. We haven't taken a strong position. I don't even know if a 1 in 5 weather 24 hourly shape exists, but if it did, theoretically that would kind of capture a worst day a little bit better than a 1 in 2. After it would change the PRM as well, but maybe the shape has some effects where more of the hours are high rather than a single peak hour. But remains to be seen. Need allocation after the CEC's presentation maybe a month ago now. Maybe it was 2 weeks ago. I'm losing it all. But bottoms up, we think that works based on the LSEs, the same negotiation process to determine the peak. We still apply that with the shape determined by maybe historical LSE loads is what we're suggesting at this point. So I want to point out SE, and Jeff will talk about this later. SE had talked about kind of a by customer class. After hearing from the CEC, think this is like the best path forward to have kind of shapes for each LSE based on their historical load. Still meeting the single peak hour that the CEC process already produces. So market products, so the resource attributes and capabilities, all RA attributes and capabilities are bundled. So that's flex, local, generic. As much as those exist and need to be shown, those all are bundled together. The hours are also bundled together. So you're not buying a CCGT for hourly 1. You're buying you're not buying 50 megawatts of a CCGT for hourly 1. You're buying 50 megawatts of CCGT and its associated kind of counting capabilities, which is in our framework all hours. And we're currently not proposing load trading or obligation trading swaps, but we're not opposed to it. It could be an add-on to this framework if that is seen to add value. So market obligation, so all capabilities, all hours. So if a 100 megawatt resource is shown for 50 megawatts, as a 50 megawatt must offer obligation for its full capabilities. So within all of its other capabilities. Use limitations. So to even qualify for RA, we're still proposing to maintain the 4-hour requirement. So that's not strictly necessary in a 24 slice framework because it explicitly takes into account use limitations, but we think that's like a good policy decision to maintain the 4-hour requirement. Think that this framework eliminates MCC buckets, especially the ones that correspond to daily use limits and flex requirements, as the resource portfolio will show that it meets needs in all hours. Maybe we'll move on to the next one. So penalties for non-compliance. Same as today, CPUC penalty for failing showing. In this framework, you fail showing. You'd fail your showing if you didn't meet your requirements in any slice. So the concept is it's not 24 individual showings. It's a single showing where there's just tests on your portfolio, demonstrating that you can meet reliability in every slice. And then the CAISO, we're proposing the CAISO allocate backstop costs to LSCs who fail their CPU showing first, and then remaining costs are allocated to all LSCs. So Jeff, do you want to cover any other details here?
Just one thing. So we are trying to keep the profiles as simple as possible, and we're not sure what that means yet. But we would like to keep, the solar profiles to as few as are appropriate. There may be some geography, there may be some technology, tracking, non-tracking. Same with wind. We may need Northern California, Southern California, different profiles. But we ideally would have very simple profiles. And as Brent was saying, there may be some adjustment to the NQC based on a specific facility. To sort of scale that profile. That's our objective, to keep the profiles as as limited as is reasonable, but it just won't be one profile for each of those technologies, but we're trying to limit the number of profiles.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to do. Oh, go on.
Oh, I should add, in a couple slides we'll talk about kind of what this NQC list, or kind of the RA capacity list or database table would look like, or might look like, and then it's an example showing, and then example CPUC kind of compliance check. And
So,
maybe we'll take questions after we show it all.
Yeah, well, let me do one more slide and then we'll go to questions, okay? So we'll do one more slide, and this is sort of changes that we've made, and then we'll open up for some questions. So Brent talked about some of this, but here we go. Here's some of the changes we've made since we've been talking sort of publicly before. As I talked about, we're sort of going to let some of the big hairy policy issues and the technical accounting issues. We're not proposing specifics at this stage. We're willing to engage in those discussions. I've got them listed here, but we're not proposing specifics at this stage. We're open to a lot of ideas, and it'll all have to work together once we have the framework determined. Resource counting for standalone batteries and hybrids. One thing before we said is that we thought batteries should only cycle once a day. We don't think that anymore. We had a lot of talks with folks, and some technologies are capable of doing multiple cycles per day. Another thing we said, we proposed some sort of like efficiency loss. We were just going to apply it. We're not proposing that anymore. We think that each individual resource can sort of state its efficiency loss, sort of this database we'll talk about. And we'll treat the efficiency losses on a project-by-project basis in our sort of counting on how much capacity you need to bring to charge your own battery. So we're open to multiple cycles, and we're open to using sort of actual efficiency losses in the showings. Also, hybrid resources. Brent expressed the general principle. They should be able to show based on their engineering capabilities, based on what we think is possible. How we actually work that out, we think will be helpful to talk more. I think we have a workshop on Friday. We're talking about batteries. That's just something our principle is, whatever they're capable of doing, they should be able to show. We want to talk more on how we actually effectuate that. We talked about load shapes. We thought we could simplify things by putting people into different load shapes. It turns out that it's more complicated than that. And the CEC seemed open to doing sort of LSC-specific 24-hour load shapes. And as long as the CEC is comfortable with that, we're okay with it. So as Brent said, individual LSC load shapes, 24 hours through basically an expanded CEC process, but the same general idea. And we'll also use that process to ultimately calibrate to make sure the sum of the LSC requirements equals the total of the load shape that we're trying to meet. So we'll have some flavor of calibration to make sure the sum equals the whole and it's not over or under. And that's one way we can address sort of the concerns about potential non-coincident over procurement. The CEC does a coincident factor, and then we can do a true up based to the actual load shape to make sure we're not over or under procuring when we sum up the individuals. So you think we can handle that through the CEC. We're going to propose, and we'll talk more about it, a standard template that LSCs will use when they make their showing. And we'll talk more about it, but everyone will just basically list their resources and their 24 hours of use for each resource. They'll submit that to the CPUC, and we'll talk more. The CPUC will have a tool that will check to validate. And as Brent said, it's a single showing per month, but you have to pass all 24 hours. You have to have enough capacity to charge your batteries, and you have to make sure that you are using the right profiles. And you are not, if you only have a 100 megawatt resource, you can't show it for 120 megawatts. Just some simple logic tests to make sure that what you're showing is actually feasible within the portfolio and your control of the portfolio. And Brent did mention we're not proposing any form of load trading, but if there are others would like to propose mechanics for that and how it would tag on, we're not opposed to people proposing that, but we're not including that as part of our core proposal. Okay, so then unless Brent, you had anything, I think it would be a good time to pause for questions. And just could the speaker let us know when we have to end, because we do have a few more slides, and I want to take questions, but I want to make sure we get to our slides. So when's our ending time?
So 11:35. You can monitor it, or I can give you like a 10 or 15 minute warning.
Okay, well, let's open up for questions, but I want to save at least 10 minutes for some of the other slides.
And this is the note taker. Will people please identify their organizations when they speak, because some of you have them identified and some of you don't even have last names. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
Okay, first up is Sergio.
Hi, this is Sergio Dueñas from CISA. Oh, great. This is exactly the slide where I had a question. So first off, I'd say CISA staff is very welcoming of this change of, or explicitly saying, let's count it based on the capacity and duration as shown by the LSC. That really does unlock a lot of flexibility. So based on that, I was wondering if for storage, retaining this minimum 4-hour daily output seems to be a little counterintuitive, assuming that LSCs have the flexibility to show it as they want. Right, so let's imagine, and I think this is particularly important for behind the meter resources, that it's also a part of the current RA proceeding to see how we incorporate them. So a 2-hour battery that might as well exist behind the meter, it could be shown or shaped for 4 hours, having half its capacity as a must offer obligation. It would still be consistent with 24/7 must offer at CAISO. So I was wondering if you had some thoughts on that. We think, and we'll talk about this in Friday's workshop, that having this minimum 4-hour daily output requirement is a little bit necessary for storage under this arrangement, since really it takes away from the flexibility of how LSCs can show. So just wondering if you had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll take it. So I agree that there's no technical need to have that in the 24 slice proposal. We've retained it for kind of consistency with kind of historical RA practices. Whether that's necessary or not, I think it's a good discussion to have, especially with the CPUC, and see how they're seeing how many resources they want to manage. That same let's say 10 megawatt 20 megawatt hour battery would still count for this. It just you wouldn't count it at its 10, wouldn't count 10 megawatts. You'd count 20, you can count it at 5 megawatts.
Okay, so if an LSC wants to shape a storage resource for 3 hours, it cannot be done under this framework.
No, so it's the kind of price of entry to become an RA resource. That's what we're saying, to retain. To the price of entry is that you need to be able to deliver power for 4 hours, and so not that you have to show 4 hours. Like you could have a resource only show 1 hour potentially, and that would reduce your total excess capacity for charging. I did some math, and it looks like a highly efficient battery, like a modern battery, you can do 11 hours theoretically, and the other hours charging, 11 hours of kind of full capacity discharge. I don't expect that anyone would actually do that, would actually show it that way, because then all those other the other hours of the day you'd have to bring the corresponding excess capacity. But yeah, so yeah, we're just saying that's the price of entry, not a showing limit.
Yeah, but for clarity, you can never show more than your, I'll call it NQC in a given hour. And what Brent is saying is that your NQC is determined on your 4-hour capability, not your 1-hour capability. That's our current proposal.
But and definitely subject to further discussion. I don't think we have a strong preference. This is maintaining the current system.
And I'll say, I don't think it's fair, I'm using that a lot, if we'd allow batteries to do this, but not other resources. So if you're going to allow, let's just say 2-hour batteries, I think you necessarily are arguing that you allow 2-hour RA resources of any flavor. And I think that's where you start getting into the policy question on, is that administratively preferable, doable, desirable? And then you get into the ISO's sort of core argument that they know things are going to be bad, but they don't know exactly when they're going to be bad. And they want to make sure that even with their bad guess, sorry, ISO, if you're on, they've got enough operating flexibility that they can cover the really bad part. And I think that was one of the arguments for give it to us for 4 hours. And somewhere in that 4 hours is going to be the bad part, and we know we get it. So those are sort of the policy discussions.
Yeah, we have a lot of hands up, so I suggest we move on.
Okay.
Paul Nelson.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson on behalf of CPUC. I wanted to get a little better understanding. You have standalone batteries and then use limited resources as sort of two separate categories, and why you've carved out batteries separately from other use limited resources.
So it's mostly because battery. So they're very similar, right? That they need to be shown within their capabilities, but batteries also come with them in this framework, a requirement to bring excess capacity to charge them. So that's kind of the main difference between, in this proposal, standalone batteries and other energy limited resources.
Okay. Yeah, now I get it. I guess when I saw the in other hours for the dispatch, I don't know, for some reason I didn't think this meant, oh, you need excess capacity for the charging. Okay, now I understand clearer. Thank you.
Yeah, and dispatch is probably not the best word there, but yeah, within they're showing. But yeah, thanks, Paul.
Next up is Julia.
Thank you, Brett. Thanks, Jeff, very much for this. I really appreciate it. I have 3 quick questions. One builds upon, and this is Julia Prosnick, and thanks, Barbara, for all the great note-taking with the Long Duration Energy Storage Association of California. On the first question, piggybacking on Sergio's, when we keep referencing batteries, I also am thinking all the different types of batteries that are out there, in addition to lithium-ion, zinc, thermal, chemical, and all the different types of storage that are out there. When we kept mentioning the daily limit of 4 hours, how do you envision 8-hour storage resources showing up and being given credit here?
Yes, so we expect that, in fact, on slide 5 of the deck, if you have it, so we'll get to there eventually.
Okay.
Too far down.
Yeah, I went too far to show how the battery.
Okay. So that just like a 4-hour battery, any technology that's closed loop would have this within its capability. So an 8-hour battery obviously has different capabilities. So that's the maximum continuous energy in KISO language, and so you'd be able to show 8 hours straight or 6 hours straight or whatever the 5 hours straight, whatever the capabilities of that resource are. And obviously that brings a different level of benefits, right? Especially if we expect the peak periods to to be longer
Exactly.
in the future or in a certain month. So yeah, so that's where the benefits would come, is in the characteristics of that resource. And that gets to a kind of key finding as we've built out this framework, is that those characteristics are going to need to be well understood by the seller, the buyer, to CAISO, and the CPUC. CAISO already knows it. It's the CPUC that needs it as well.
And I'm glad you bring that up, because that's my second question, is if you eliminate the flex requirements, does that hurt the hybrid resources? Because are you limiting the characteristics that you're giving credit to?
Hurt. I want to say no, but I'm not quite sure how to address the question. So yeah, does flex add value to resources today, and getting rid of it? I don't know how to address that.
I don't know. We've got so many changes in the framework, right? Because we're going from a point showing with a flex characteristic to a 24-hour showing where your flexibility and your ability to shape it's not even recognized today, your ability to shape hours. So the whole framework changes, and what's going to become binding or in most demand, I think it's going to be very dynamic as the fleet changes, as load shapes change.
And that's great, Jeff, because that's my last question is, does the simple profiles limit us in the diversity of technologies we're going to need, and the diversity of the state we're going to need? We're going to need all this. So are we limiting ourselves too much by making this too simple, or do we have enough flexibility built in to address the technologies that are starting to show up, in the next year?
Well, certainly on batteries, we're not shaping, right? Back to your 8-hour battery. The only kind, let's just say it's 100 megawatts. You can never show more than 100 megawatts, but you could show that in any 8 hours as long as it was kind of feasible. So we really recognize the flexibility that you're bringing in a 24-hour framework. And I'm not quite sure, in the hybrid resources, again, we'll talk more about it, but based on, we want to be able to show whatever we think is an engineeringly honest assessment of what they're capable of doing, given their interconnection limits and all those type of things. So it seems like showing 24 hours is really going to let you capture and let you demonstrate the flexibility of technology, where a single point like today doesn't.
Well, this is very helpful for Friday, so thank you both very much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay, please remember to lower your hands when you're done. Next up is Sumara.
Hi, thanks so much, and thanks for the presentation. This is Sumara with the Alliance for Resource Energy Markets, and I think I said that wrong, didn't I?
Resource Energy Markets, I renamed.
Retail.
That was retail.
Retail.
Retail Energy Markets, I thought, let's rebranding.
I'm getting too old, I think that's it. So I have a question about how you describe your load forecast proposal. Were you intending to support the proposal that Lynn Marshall made at the last workshop?
Yes. So that with the hourly check, just like we do for the single monthly, each hour we'll have to make sure that the individual loads add up to the whole. But yeah, exactly.
Okay. Okay, well, the reason I'm asking, and this came up in the survey questions too, I wouldn't really describe it as a bottoms-up approach. I would describe it as a hybrid. It's basically what is done today, except they will, the Energy Commission will now be doing it for 24 hours every month. And also part of Lynn's proposal was that, as we do today, LSCs would submit peak forecasts. So they'd submit forecasts for the 24 hours, but you are mentioning using historical load. So was that a change you were going to make from what's done now?
Yeah, well, so the specific proposal, and this could change if based on the additional CEC feedback, but expect that same peak, like LSC submit their peaks, the coincidence factor, make sure that the peak adds up to the system peak. So all that will happen. In addition, instead of having LSC submit their own 24 shape, it's actually historical based. So the demonstrated load reductions that the LSCs have done in the past will show up in the shapes that are applied at this stage. That there might be other ways to do this that are just as good or better, but this is what we're proposing today as maintaining all the current process, but then adding adding data the CEC already has, which is historical shapes, and then some true ups to make sure we get to the full amount.
So the CEC does get all the historical information from the LICs, and they get the forecast. So again, I'm confused by your answer. Are you making a change to Lynn Marshall's proposal? Let me ask it that directly. Or are you supporting what she presented at the workshop last time?
I think it's largely consistent, right? It's largely consistent, but a little more specific about how that 24-hour shape of whatever the LSE shape is will be derived. And we're specifically saying that historical shapes, since the CC already has that information, should be used. That's currently not something that's done today, but preserve all the existing process for the single peak and then apply, at the CC, apply the historical shapes.
But it is done today, actually. It is done with the CEC does look at the historical information and compares that to the forecast for each LSE and determines if there's any divergence and follows up on it. So it is done today.
But Sue, what they don't do is 24 hours.
Right.
So we're saying
the only difference
we need to
is
shape.
hours.
We need to get it. Right now we have a point. In the new world, we need a 24-hour shape. So we're saying use the historic shape as part of the process. The 24-hour shape as part of the process.
Well, I would just say ARM would be whatever the Energy Commission proposes, ARM will support. And if you want to do something different than when the Energy Division proposes, then I would like to have to hear more about why you think that's appropriate. So, thank you.
Okay, at this point, we still have 7 people in the queue. I think we should just let Jeff and Brent finish the proposal first, and then see how much time we have left for those remaining questions or anyone else who joins the queue.
Okay, we'll try to be quick so we can get to questions, because I do want to do it. So 24-hour showing. Here's kind of it in a picture. You got to stack up all your resources and meet your planning reserve margin in every hour. And you have to bring enough extra capacity to match your battery discharge plus an efficiency loss. So that's sort of the big picture. So mechanically, how are we going to do this? And we think it's going to be going to need some tools at the PUC, but it's pretty straightforward. We'll have each LSC identify the resources that are in its showing. I mean, here we have all these different colors that are representing resources, but we'll have a spreadsheet, and each resource will have a unique ID. We'll say what sort of resource type that is, and it's because different types of resources will have different profiles. And then how much, basically an NQC type of concept, do you control the resource? This might be a 400 megawatt resource in total, but you only control, or you only have contracted 150 megawatts. And each LSC will just list all of its resources, however many it has in this I don't know how many there were here. And if you can imagine, this chart actually should be right here on this page, but it couldn't fit. And then for each resource, you'll give a 24-hour profile. So here we had a 150 megawatt resource, and it was, I think, a on-peak or heavy load import. So we're showing from hour ending 6 through 16, or actually to 6 through 23, whatever this resource is, that it's hour ending 7 through 23, that it's 150 megawatts. And in the hours it's not delivering, ooh, someone's mooning me. In the hours it's not delivering, it's 0. And likewise, this was a biomass, and it's sort of a constantly running resource. The person's got 15 megawatts, so biomass, 15 megawatts across all 24 hours. So this is the information that an LSC will submit to the PUC as part of its showing. Here's my resource list. Here's the amount of megawatts I control of that resource. And here is the 24-hour use profile for my showing for each resource. Now, behind the scenes, the PUC already has things that it does where it keeps track of, for this resource, I said maybe it was 400 megawatts. They keep track of which LSC is counting that resource, and to make sure that the resource owner knows that it's being counted, and the sum of the LSCs don't exceed whatever I said, 400 megawatts if multiple people are showing it. All that'll still have to go on as it is today. But people will show their resources and a 24-hour resource plan to the PUC. So that'll be the LSC's obligation. Now, this is an unreadable eye chart. I apologize in advance, but if you have the deck. Now we're kind of looking at it from, well, what does the PUC do? How do they validate that you're good? And again, the PUC is making sure that graphically you have met your green line, which is your load shape and your planning reserve margin in all 24 hours. They're also making sure that you've brought enough excess capacity to charge your batteries. And the batteries are these sort of gold colors here. So that's graphically what they're doing. So in a tabular form, in a spreadsheet form, the PUC will plop the information you just gave them, resource list, 24-hour resource profile, into a checking tool. They'll just dump the information right into this tool. And this tool will have a couple logical checks, like, did you show more than you said you had? You said you had 150. Do any of these cells show more than 150? And if you do, you'll fail. And we're also, for like wind, there's going to be, I don't know, maybe there's a northern or southern profile. There'll be a check to make sure that you're using the correct profile for your wind resource. So it's a correct profile being used. So they'll do a little sort of mechanical checks just to make sure you kind of didn't do anything mechanically wrong. And then the tool will also check to make sure that you had enough capacity in each hour to meet your line. So I think the RA requirement is this top line. I view that, the CEC will determine your load shape, and then there'll be a planning reserve margin. Right now we're proposing the same planning reserve margin every hour, just sort of a slab on top of it. The PUC will know that sort of independently, that that's what you need to meet. Right? The CEC said that's what it was. They'll know what it is, and they will plop your numbers in. Assuming you pass these checks, they'll add up all the numbers, and they'll make sure that, yes, in each hour, you have met your requirement. And they'll also do a quick check to make sure that you have enough excess capacity, and we're proposing, based on the efficiency of all of your storage, to charge your storage. And there may be a little logic limiting per hour, you can only charge so much. You can't charge more than the storage can charge in a given hour. So it's sort of an hourly plus a total test, just to make sure you've met your storage. So automated tool, you submit this information, the PUC plops it in their tool, and you come back, in this case, pass, 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 everything checked out. Mechanically, you did things right. You brought enough stuff to the table. It's a single showing. You pass or fail. You have to pass everything to pass. And this LSC passed. They get the green light from the PUC. They're good. And just one more slide that I didn't really get into. So we see that in order for the PUC to do this, and in order for people to trade, we're going to have more information on resources going forward. Right now, it's kind of like a single point value in NQC. We're going to have to know more than that going forward. And we envision that there's going to be something like a database that describes the resources and their attributes. And this would be something that we need to be public, so people can trade around it. So if they know if they're signing a deal with this biomass resource, that it's 15 megawatts of capacity, we'll call it NQC, and this biomass resource can run 24 hours a day, and it doesn't have any run hour limits. Now let's go to another resource, and here it's called a sun. Technology is sun, sort of like solar, I guess. And its capacity is 31.36, and what is this? Riverside East PV. So we've just assumed that there's a profile for solar that's located in the Riverside area, whatever, however it is. It'll have a profile. So if someone goes out and does a deal with this solar, they know they're going to get this profile. And, you know, there may be slightly different profile shapes, north-south, or tracking, non-tracking, however we ultimately slice the profiles up. But the person who's getting this needs to know what profile they're getting, because ultimately they're going to have to stack it, and they're going to have to see how that shape fits within their needs. And we did do a little thinking, and there'll be more to talk about it. On hybrid resources, they're a little more complicated. Not only are we going to need to know capacity, but we're going to need to know stuff like how big is the battery? How duration is the battery? You know, here it's a 100 megawatt battery, 500 megawatt hours. What is sort of their production capability? Let's just say it's solar, 120. And what's their interconnection capability? Here we've got 100 because, you know, hybrid resources are ultimately limited in output based on their interconnection. But depending on how they're designed, on sized, oversized or not, they may have more or less physical capability depending on their design. So people will need to know this. So long way of saying, we envision moving forward not just a list of units with their NQC, but a list of units with their NQC and some important attributes. So let's do one here that had some sort of hour limitations. For example, a DR resource, great. We need to know how much capacity it's got, great. We also need to know how many hours it's good for. In this case, it was 4. But in this one, we've got a program that, you know, it's only good for hours 18 through 22. That's this DR program. So when you do your showing, if you've got some DR, you can only show it in hours 18 through 22. Maybe that helps you, maybe it doesn't. So people are going to need to know what they're getting. They're going to need to know the profile they're getting. They're going to need to know the run hours, and they're going to need to know if there's only windows that it can run in. So this is new. This doesn't exist today. The ISO knows all this information. The PUC doesn't know all this information. The market doesn't know all this information. In this framework, we're going to have a publicly available database that will be used by the PUC in trading. Okay, Brent, you were going to say something. No, stop.
Yeah, and I think a key item to note here is that contracts, procurement would be based on, and sales and purchase would be based on a megawatt quantity and the technology, right? So, you know, resource 2 is a solar resource that's 31.36 megawatts. That's what you're buying. You're buying a portion of this plant, you know, maybe not the whole 31 megawatts, and then that portion has characteristics. So you're not, you know, you're not buying, you know, 10 megawatts in a certain hour. You're really buying a portion of this underlying resource, and maybe its profile after you shape it is 10 megawatts, but you have to. We're expecting parties to do that math. So if someone needs 10 megawatts of hour ending 18, you figure out what the kind of equivalent solar plants you need are. And so I think this has been kind of a point of contention, maybe a point of confusion of like how contracting would be done. Be still done similar to today, which is done on a megawatt basis for a specific resource. I also want to add that I left off hybrids should have an efficiency number, and want to highlight that again, a change from our initial proposal is that, you know, efficiency is one of the characteristics of a resource and would be the individual efficiency of that resource would be taken into account for the excess storage capacity. So incentivizes, you know, higher efficiency units. You know, it gives credit for them.
Okay, we're going to pause for questions. I think we have 5-ish minutes.
And then actually Carrie ceded 5 minutes of her time. So let's start with Noah.
Hi, thanks. This is Noah Tong from Middle River Power. Can we go back to that slide where you had the capacity? I think there was that you were just on. Yeah, that one. Yeah. So on the capacity column, what slice is that from? Because my assumption or my thinking here is that that will go into a supply plan for the CAISO. So which slice is that being validated against?
Yeah, so there'd probably be some coordination with CAISO. So it's we haven't taken a strong position on exactly the formulation of that. We've talked a lot about this profile. This needs to be a single monthly that then can relate to the profile for the CPUC showing. After some discussions with parties, expect that to correspond to the CAISO's system. So that's probably gross peak contribution, and then the profile would be corresponding to the gross peak or the equivalent. But love to have further discussion if you have ideas on exactly how that single number should be formulated. We should definitely have further discussions, especially as we talk about profiles and exceedances.
Okay, and so if the CAISO is only checking one of the slices, but not the other slices, and the CPUC is it okay if LSEs end up being deficient in other non-gross peak slices, and the ISO wouldn't then CPM for that?
So CAISO CPM decisions are going to be what they are. Failing to meet the CPUC showing would definitely lead to CPUC penalties. Whether those translate to CPM and then charges, that's dependent on the CAISO process.
Yeah, but conceptually, we're proposing the same process. If you fail your CPUC showing, you're at risk for two costs. First, you're going to get penalized by the CPUC. Second, if the ISO CPMs, you're going to be first in line to share a portion of the CPM costs. So we're proposing that same structure, but you are right. At least initially, there's going to be sort of a simplification the ISO does, where based on its tools and our understanding and talking with them, they're only going to look at 1, maybe 2 points, where the CPUC is going to look at all 24 hours.
Okay, and then so if our penalties assessed on LSEs who missed one particular slice, as if they've missed it for the entire month, or is the penalty structure changing as well to reflect the hourly slices that are being deficient?
So our initial proposal is status quo, but that's something we think we should talk more about.
Gotcha. And how do you envision procurement by CAM or CPE for energy storage to be allocated out to LSEs? Who determines that the slices to which the energy storage would go towards?
I think that's an easy one. So if the allocation is a megawatt of a 4-hour battery, the LSE would be able to show that megawatt within the capabilities. And there's no need to tie between to make sure everyone's showing in the same hours. Is that megawatt can be shown as needed by the LSE if there was a CAM allocation of the capabilities.
I see. So put it another way, the energy division would allocate out one particular sort of credit that's applicable to all 24 hours, and then the LSC would figure out whether it's a battery resource that's credited or a solar resource that's credited or a thermal resource that's credited, and then they would have to figure out how to apply the credit.
I'm going to say yes, but maybe we'll move on.
Okay.
And sounds like each LSE would be free. All right, Noah, there are 6 people behind you. So
I understand, but I have a lot of questions. I mean, we're here, right? One last question. Are you explicitly proposing to eliminate the flex RA requirements and process?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, so as I said, there are 6 people still left with hands up. Please be as succinct as possible. Bridget, you're next.
Thanks. So my question is about the storage allowing to count for multiple cycles and how to keep track of that, and then also making sure you have excess energy in the right hours to charge it, because obviously these have to be somewhat sequential. So you can't have, you know, 2 discharges back to back without enough time in between to charge it. So one maybe thought I had was for multi-cycle storage, maybe putting a negative value in the hours it's supposed to be charging, and then that way there'd sort of be an implicit check, because then it would lower your ability to meet your load plus PRM. So just throwing out that thought, and then also just kind of question on how you guys have thought about how to keep track of the multi-cycles and making sure that it's being counted appropriately, and, you know, folks aren't counting capacity in hours that's, you know, operationally infeasible. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's actually where we started of like having negative capacity shown. It seemed like the cost of doing that, like the kind of complication of having the showing kind of not capacity, but kind of this negative charging capacity added some complication. If there is value added, like this could incorporate that. But right now, our proposal is for just a check across the day, across this 24 hours, make sure that at some point there is enough excess capacity, and that downtime is respected. So that'd be within the capabilities of the resource. But the proposal not currently, like if you show 4 hours, you have to have 4 hours of a 4-hour battery. You have to have 5 hours of the total, you know, capacity, you know, in between. That's not currently in the proposal. If there's benefits, or if there's some kind of operational concern, I think that would be interesting to explore. Generally, we've kind of shied away from like having this appear to be a dispatch model at all. Right, so it's not that we're not saying this is how it's going to run. It's just kind of a showing, you know, a showing dynamic rather than like actual operations. But I'd love to discuss more.
Yeah, and just real quick, I think in your original proposal where storage counted for 1 cycle, your like simplified planning made more sense. But I think if we're moving to more multi-cycles, I think we should kind of revisit that, and that may have to be a little bit more of a like dispatch look, especially if you're going to try and count it for like, you know, 3 cycles or 2 cycles. You know, I think the ISO would have real concerns that, you know, making sure that we're checking things and planning correctly. So.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay, next up is Greg.
Greg Clapp for Western Power Trading Forum. 3 quick questions. Have you run the compliance logistics and mechanisms past Energy Division? And if so, can you characterize their reaction to the complexity?
I'd rather let the Energy Division speak for themselves. So we have had conversations, but I don't want to speak for them. Okay, fair enough. And on the market product, what is, and this is for my own edification, what is the rationale for not allowing procurement of resources by slice? Administrative complexity and tracking, as well as inconsistency with how the must offer works. What's the inconsistency?
So if a resource sells 50 megawatts in slice 1, they actually then own a 24-hour must offer obligation. So if you're in for a nickel, you're in for a dime. So why does it matter? I don't understand why that would be a reason for not allowing trading of hourly slices. Yeah, but it's mostly around the complexity of tracking all of these individual products. Okay. And then third is the saying, well, maybe LSCs could swap load. Is that a way to smooth out what could otherwise be very lumpy procurement? Once we get down to this granular of a level, the lumpiness returns,
because you could have like a 1 hour need, 1 hour in the middle of the night, you're 2 megawatts short. You have to buy a resource for 24 hours to cover that 2 megawatts.
Yeah, we think that, again, we're not proposing that. We'll let others.
No, I know you're not.
Argue the merits of that. We think that by just swapping resources, we'll be able to handle the vast majority of load resource shape matching without having to do crazy over procurement.
Yeah. So
swap a full resource for a flex. Swap a full for a flex.
Okay.
Or use the energy limited. So I will say that the analysis, the limited analysis we've done, I don't think an hour ending 2 need is going to crop up as long as someone has batteries in their portfolio. It's always going to be, peak. It's going to be around the peak. That's where people, if people are short, that's where they're going to be short.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Brian, if you can ask a question quickly, we'll let you ask the final question, and everyone else with their hands up, you can ask your questions in the chat or hold them to this afternoon.
Hi, Brian, if you're talking, I think you're on mute. I can't hear you. I see you lighting, but I can't hear you. Okay, you look like you're off mute, but I can't hear you. Hi, Brian. Brian, I'm sorry. Brent, can you hear him? I can't hear anything. I see him lit up, but I can't hear him.
Yeah, same. Brian, why don't we just go ahead and we'll move on, and then likewise, you can either ask your question in the chat or hold it this afternoon.
Sorry, Brian.
Okay. All right. So next up, we have Carrie giving the next presentation, I mean.
I'm like, I don't have a question.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, everyone, thank you very much.
Next on stage.
Bye, guys.
Okay, this is just a chat. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, you can hear me. Okay, great. And I can't see the chat. So if anyone has an issue, let me know. Okay, so I am Carrie Bentley.
Carrie,
go ahead.
Let me interrupt really quickly. I'm getting a notification, and it may just be some glitch on my end, but it says this meeting chat is muted. So I don't know if maybe one of the PG&E folks accidentally muted the chat. You can look into that, PG&E staff. Thanks.
Okay.
All right, go ahead, Carrie.
Great. Oh, here. You guys see me too? Okay, perfect. So hi, I'm Carrie Bentley. Really appreciate the facilitator's help on this, especially Lisa on PG&E. I thought she really worked hard to make sure that all the proposals provided some consistency in their content. And I think that'll make it a lot better to be able to compare the proposals. So I'm Carrie Bentley. I'm co-founder and CEO of Gridwell Consulting. My background is primarily at the CAISO RA rules. I designed the California ISO's backstop procurement, the CPM, portions of the forced and planned outage rules, and then the RA availability incentive mechanism. Since coming into consulting, I primarily work in the RA space along with batteries. I've evaluated endless RA contracts over the last 5 years. Most people do know me because I represent the Western Power Trading Forum at the California ISO, but I want to make clear I don't represent them here. Greg Klatt does that. That said, the number one policy position that WPTF has in CAISO space is consistency between the CAISO and CPUC and consistency in RA rules among the different proceedings. So my take on RA very much is that IRP needs to be connected to RA, and RA at the CPUC needs to be connected to RA at the CAISO. I also believe that the products need to be connected so that system RA and local RA need to be consistent. A friendly reminder to everyone, about 2/3 of California CAISO assets are in a local area. So that local RA attribute is incredibly important, and it's incredibly important to think about the local RA attribute in connection to system RA. We haven't talked a lot about that. I don't think we've actually talked about it nearly enough in either my framework or SCE's full credit or detriment to both of us here. But with the CPE and how that works, how local RA procurement works will directly relate to the underlying system attributes, and whether that's a 24-hour attribute or whether it's a net peak load attribute, we're going to have to work through those issues. So I'm going to go through my framework, but I want to say I think that's the biggest gap that we haven't talked about so far. So the scope, I'm going to go through just one quick slide on a little bit of the motivation behind, not just hopping on board with the 24-hour proposal and going to a 2-slice. I'm then going to review the high-level framework and then address some prior questions on how this framework meets CPUC principles. I think it's been really helpful. I've been given the opportunity multiple times along with Vistra to present some of the details. So really, I'm just going to move it up a high level this time and then include framework details in the deck itself. I've had a lot of great meetings with multiple parties. I'm perfectly willing to keep taking them and working through the details. One main question I've been asked a couple times is, am I fixed on anything in particular? And I'd say no. The more information I've been getting, the more I've been trying to adapt this to party preference. So completely willing to take different options and consider how to incorporate your ideas into this. And then finally, at the end, I do have a pro-con recap because I think it's important to view not just the pros of a proposal, but the cons. And there are some cons to this proposal that I want to be really upfront about. So going into the motivation, I think my initial response to the SCE's proposal is it's troubling to me from more of a commercial perspective. I see how it can work from a reliability perspective. I do think you can't have a planning reserve margin in all hours that's the same. Because your resource mix will be very different in some of the hours, and the way you're now using exceedance for solar. Every loss of load expectation study we've seen done shows that how you count solar directly will impact your PRM. So I think with a 24-hour proposal, you are going to have a changing PRM, but once you do that, I think it will meet the reliability needs of the grid. So my problem with SCE's proposal really isn't on the reliability side. It's more on the transactability and cost side. Is it efficient? And I think this proposal offers a more efficient way to meet grid reliability. And the main way it does that is it maintains the distinction between capacity and energy. It says that you need to have this distinction to make sure that your energy market stays a pure marginal cost energy market, and your capacity market values a resource with a single transactable product that said, here's the value to grid reliability. And the general definition for capacity is it's based on the value of an asset, its contribution to grid reliability over a long period of time. Other markets in the United States, they don't have monthly. They view that long period of time as summer and winter. Here in California, that long period of time is over a month. But you could look at it, slice and dice it in different ways. But no matter what it is, it's the capacity is the value to grid reliability over a long period. This is very different than energy value, which is based on day-to-day power deliveries to the grid. So you take a solar resource, for example, and you say, what is the value of building another solar megawatt in California? Well, in terms of capacity, there isn't a lot of value, right? If we build more solar, that's not going to help us. If we have another megawatt of load, another megawatt of solar isn't going to help us meet that new megawatt of load. But what it is going to do is that solar is going to help us meet our renewable energy goals. And that primarily is valued within the energy value of solar. And if you look at solar dispatch, it's almost must take in some ways, right? We self-schedule it in. A lot of solar is paid in terms of energy, and that's appropriate. And it's renewable attributes, and that's also appropriate. But when we're talking about the capacity value of solar and how we're going to transact that solar megawatt, that's where it's important to think, what is its reliability contribution to the grid over a long period of time, not just in 1 hour. So that's a first motivation. Second motivation, which it sounds like from the survey results, everyone agrees with, which I thought was really, really rewarding and great that we all agree to this. And that's, a requirement should yield a loss of load expectation of not more than 1 day in 10 years. And we all think that, loss of load expectation studies should be done routinely. And we should start, making a more conscientious effort to either have, a requirement or a planning reserve margin that actually reflects the needs of the grid, and that because of our changing resource mix, we should continually update that study. So it's good to see consensus around that. The next motivation for the two-slice proposal is that counting rules, I believe, should accurately value a resource's contribution to grid reliability. That is, I should be able to see 100 megawatt resource and another 100 megawatt resource, and I should have one number that accurately says what their contribution to reliability is. So I should be able to, for instance, long duration storage. I should be able to say, what is the value of this 8-hour technology compared to this 4-hour technology? And there should be a number that quantifies that. And then we should be able to transact and have a price around that number. And I think really having just an accurate number is the only way we can make efficient investment and then eventually retirement decisions. And this really will depend on both developers and planners having an accurate picture of not just our need, but a resource's value. And that way we're able to compare the reliability, value, and costs of different technology types. I presented on this, I think 2 workshops ago, but our next reliability challenge is going to be the transition away from the natural gas fleet. I think it is 2 presentations ago. If you're more interested, I'm happy to present the details on the age of the gas fleet, but tough decisions are going to come up on whether we're going to let these resources retire just naturally due to age, and which resources we're going to focus on preserving. And without getting a really accurate value of one resource's technology and reliable contribution compared to another, those decisions are going to be really hard. But entry decisions and exit decisions depend on good information. And then finally, I did mention I worked at the CAISO, so this should be no surprise. I think we need to maintain our load and resource diversity benefits. One of the largest benefits of joining an ISO is that you don't just get coincident loads, which is in the tune of $250 million of savings a year, but you also get resource diversity benefits. And so resource diversity benefits are best measured in ELCC studies. It's very hard with an exceedance to capture, the coincidence or non-coincidence of certain natural technology curves. For example, one LSC may be heavy in solar, another LSC may be heavy in wind, and that's okay. And together, their joint procurement of these resources allow them to meet a joint requirement, even if individually they are deficient. But that is a natural resource diversity benefit that comes to accrues to everyone for being a part of an ISO, who then takes the must offer and converts it to energy, right? And so I think it's easy to preserve the load diversity benefit. I thought the CEC walked through a way they could do that. There are some challenges there. I think that's one of the problems of SCE's proposal, is that once you get into the details, the problems will be more apparent. But we're still at that 200,000 foot level. But I'll just say, even on the load side, allocating a coincident hourly peak, to individual LCs, even that gets a little bit tricky. But I think you could do it. What I think is harder to do is allocating the resource diversity benefits when each individual LSC is expected to procure to their own load. I see why SCE probably doesn't address this as much. They are over half the peak load. So for SCE's profile, I actually don't think this matters. For the 75 other LSCs on the CAISO system, I think it really matters. About, I forget what it is. I think every single CCA has load less than 2,000 megawatts. It's a significant number of LSCs that have peak load less than 100 megawatts. So if you're thinking that you could do resource swapping or trading, if your load is less than 100 megawatts, that's much trickier than if your load is 26,000 megawatts. And our grid of the future isn't just resource diversity, it's also load serving entity diversity. We now have CCAs and ESPs and these options that just didn't exist years ago. And so in any RA framework, I think it's important not just to address our changing resource mix and environmental goals, but also the changing entities that are serving customers. So that's the motivation. And then I just have a quick slide, which again, I presented several times, but I'll just go through it quickly. So 2 slices, gross load peak, net load peak, showings, seasonal, monthly. I sounds like monthly 1 on the survey results. I think monthly probably makes the most sense, at least initially, given the goals to have this be implementable. In the 2024, I think it'd be a big switch to go to seasonal. I personally think it's the right thing to do to go to seasonal, but proposal would be monthly, let's say. Peak requirement, Kathleen presented on this in detail. It's the Vistra proposal, nothing's changed there. Peak resource counting. The more I read about modern capacity theory and how other ISOs are doing their ELCCs, the more I think it's compelling to not pin down an exact ELCC methodology within this proceeding, and actually in a subsequent proceeding say, yes, we're going to develop ELCCs, we're going to do ELCC for more use limited types, we're going to commit to updating ELCCs every 2 years, but not pin ourselves down exactly on the methodology. I think incremental probably makes the most sense, and it has a natural alignment with IRP, but there are other ELCC methodologies being developed that I think would be worthwhile for everyone to consider. So MCC buckets, we'd be able to get rid of them. I think we still need a cap on demand response, but I haven't been following that CEC process very closely. And it sounds like maybe you could do an ELCC for demand response. I do include a link in here on an E3 study on how to do ELCC for DR. And maybe we could get rid of the demand response MCC bucket cap if one of those proposals went through. You certainly, with this proposal, because how ELCC discounts other operationally limited resources, you can get rid of the other MCC buckets. So then going to the backstop, exactly the same as today with the CPUC penalty and then the CAISO CPM. So that's kind of our basic structure. When you now get into the net peak, you could do a showing and you could either explicitly say, okay, we now have NQCs for net peak, we have a net peak requirement and do the showing, or you could do it how the CAISO does local RA today. And this is something that I hope the CAISO will present on maybe in January along with their UCAP or put out more information on. I do link in here to how the CAISO does their local RA studies, but essentially what they do is they take the showings, just the normal system showings that are in local areas, they take the local resources, and then for wind and solar, they say, okay, your new shifted peak or your net peak load, for that, your new NQC for wind and solar is the minimum of your system NQC or your historical minimum. So if your NQC is overvaluing the resource in that areas, it does shift it downward. And that's an appropriate check that we have to do in the local area to ensure local reliability. And I think it's an appropriate check to do it here as well. It just like peak, the backstop is in aggregate. So it's not that each LSC has to show sufficient capacity for their own net peak load. It's that in aggregate, all LSCs have to show sufficient net peak load to meet the net peak load requirement. And only then, if there is a system-wide deficiency, would you then start allocating costs? I actually believe it's allocated to the LRA on the CAISO side, but on the CPUC side, it then goes down to the LSC level. But I'm going to walk through these really quickly. I think I only have 5 minutes because we're going to end at 12:05. Can you guys confirm that for me?
That is the plan.
Okay. So I'm going to walk through these, and then PG&E is going to present after lunch, and then I won't be available right after we come back, but I will be here for the Q&A session. So I see there's only one hand raised now, but if people do have questions, I'll be available then. but I certainly can run through the rest of this in 5 minutes. So here are the principles. At the last workshop, there's a lot of talk about leaning. And I asked the question, I think it was to Nick, what do you mean by leaning? Why are we doing these LSC specific portfolios? And there was some implication that the MCC buckets were intended to prevent leaning. And I went back and looked at this, and I really think the MCC buckets are intended for a very different purpose that I'm going to get into. I actually couldn't find anything in the commission decision that supports the idea that we should reduce the benefits, the reduced load and supplier diversity benefits by mandating LSC specific load shapes. I just think that's absent from the commission decision. So I don't even address that because I don't think that that's the intent of the commission, nor should it be to say, let's just say the commission decision did say that. I would say we should push back on that because load and supplier diversity benefits are significant in the hundreds of millions. So we really want those benefits to accrue to ratepayers. Okay, so the first principle is balance, reliability, and costs. And so the two-slice proposal really does focus on discounting all operationally limited resources RA values. Therefore, if you can't provide energy in all hours equally up to your NQC, according to whether the grid needs you during those hours you can't provide it, your RA value is discounted. Thus, ultimately, when we make decisions what to build, we will make the more efficient decisions because resources that provide less reliability will have higher costs than resources that provide more reliability in terms of RA value. There's also an assurance by doing this that all 24 hours will retain a 1 in 10 LOLE. That's the point of having your LOLE study assumptions match up with your ELCC study assumptions. And the output of that is that if you have an example on the next slide, the output of that is that if a resource is needed for longer than, let's say, storage, if it's needed for longer than 5 hours to maintain reliability, well, its RA value will be discounted. So even though you're just meeting one target, the value of your resource is discounted to meet that one target to ensure reliability in all hours. And I just have an example here. It's pretty simplistic. But you could do it the way SCE does it, and you can have a 24-hour requirement. Or if someone is, 0.25% as useful across all hours, you could just discount the resource's capacity directly. Either way, you end up at the same answer. So next is balance energy sufficiency and green goals. And this is a good one to read, I think, for people who are concerned about the MCC buckets. I thought it was really apt that they noted the buckets were specifically to limit over-reliance on use-limited resources. And that's because previously we've counted use-limited resources the same as resources that are not use-limited. And if you count two resources the same and one is use-limited and one is not, you have to have buckets. But you don't have to have buckets if you directly now discount the capacity of the use limited resource. And so that's how this balances energy sufficiency and green goals and allows you to get rid of the use limited or the MCC buckets. The other thing I think it's important in this principle is that the commission notes a concern not with all hours of the day, the hours of the day when load still may be high and variable resources provide little or no value. That's actually in the principle itself, when load may still be high and the variable resources are providing little or no value. And that's just the truth. Solar is not going to be there, at 8 p.m. and we're going to need other resources to meet that 8 p.m. hour. That's not punitive to say that. That's just reality. And I think it's reality acknowledged by the commission. Balance granularity and transactability. I think it's really clear. Yeah.
I think at this point, you're just about out of time. Either can you wrap up very quickly, or we can just direct parties to the presentation and they can look at it for themselves.
Oh, I have 1 minute left. I think I'm good. Yep. So I think this is the most transactable by far, so I won't even discuss that. Likewise with the implementable. I also think it's durable and adaptable because it uses modern capacity theory. If you use modern capacity theory and you're at the cutting edge, it's much more likely of a paradigm to be robust in the long term. Finally, I want to get to the pros and cons. So I went through the pros a lot, but I want to just highlight briefly the cons. My biggest con that I've taken away from these frameworks is that ELCC is not globally well understood, even by knowledgeable industry professionals. So we are going to have some training on what ELCC is and its implications for the product and for reliability. This does require an intensive study every 2 years. And then it does require effort, I think, to convince the CPUC that, yeah, this is a 2-slice proposal and it meets the slice a day direction, because we have departed, from the PG&E's original framework. So pros, cons, but I think it's worthy of consideration. Thank you.
Okay,
yeah, Scott,
thanks. Well,
Scott, I just have a quick clarifying question. Carrie, are you recommending that ELCCs be calculated on a monthly basis?
You mean every month? No, I'm recommending we do it every 2 years.
Well, yeah, no, not calculated. No, the values would be set on a monthly basis as they currently are for wind and solar.
Oh, yes. Yeah, a monthly construct.
And that, okay, and so that squares with the longer term look of things. Okay, thanks.
Yep. And Peter, happy if you want to schedule a call directly. I don't think I've met with PG&E on this to walk through it.
Okay, I see. Doug, I see you have your hand raised. Do you have a quick clarifying type question or a longer question?
Well, both, but I'll go with the clarifying question.
Okay.
So as I understand it, there are 2 compliance requirements, right? There's the essentially the existing system RA requirement, and then there's a second bolt-on net peak requirement. The question I had is, if we are relying on solar and storage and all that, but no gas in our portfolios, it's going to be the storage that gets us the ELCC value to meet those compliance requirements. Can the same resource be counted for both? So if I have like 100 megawatts of storage, that's just counted to 40 or 70 or whatever it is, does that 70 count for both requirements, or do I have to have 2 separate battery systems, say they're 4-hour batteries, for like I need to have 100 for one, and then I have a second set of 100 for the other?
Yes, this is a great question, Doug. So this is the point of an ELCC, that you do get to count it for both. And when I say ELCC is not well understood, I think questions like that would be great as part of an ELCC training for our industry. Because the idea that you can count a battery that's 4 hours in both time periods is fundamental to the concept of ELCC.
And to be clear, an 8-hour storage would have a higher ELCC than 4-hour storage.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. All right, great. That was the last hand raised. So why don't we break for lunch? Everybody come back on at 12:35.
Great. Thanks, everyone.